By taking over indigenous homelands and settling from ocean to ocean, the U.S. had fulfilled a major part of its founders' dreams. The closing of the American frontier seemed to create a new challenge for the United States. In your history classes, you may have heard of historian Frederick Jackson Turner and his idea that democratic civilization was a product of the settlers' experience with the American frontier. With the long era of settler colonialism and conquest ended, what would the nation be going forward? The so-called Turner thesis, which he first presented in 1893, became the most influential perspective on the history of the U.S. West in the 20th century. Turner's ideas support the popular belief in American exceptionalism, and they continue to affect how U.S. history is taught. However, several 21st century historians see Turner's ideas as based on biases about indigenous peoples. He believed wrongly that indigenous North American culture had no real influence on the settlers except as roadblocks to progress. He viewed native cultures as backward and primitive in comparison with settlers' culture, which he saw as dynamic and sophisticated. He also had the mistaken idea that the homelands of the native people were a wilderness that had to be tamed and properly developed by settlers so that America's democracy could proceed. Even as the United States involved itself in conflicts around the world in the later half of the 1800s, it remained determined to acquire every last acre of the indigenous land within its borders. By the late 1800s, policies such as allotment had drastically reduced the remaining indigenous land base. Still, indigenous nations had homelands and reservations where they continued their traditional ways. The existence of a people with a prior claim to the land whose values, languages, and life ways differed from those of European American society was a constant source of anxiety to white settlers. For the most part, even the settlers who opposed killing native people outright believed in white supremacy and were profoundly uncomfortable with native existence and sovereignty. Settlers' anxiety around what ought to be done about native people were called the Indian problem. The way of thinking about indigenous peoples was part of the Turner's era-written thesis. To take care of this problem, additional policies and laws were developed. Many of these policies were based on what U.S. officials referred to as a choice for indigenous peoples assimilate or become extinct. Either way, the goal was still to extinguish indigenous nations so all their lands and resources would then be available to settlers. In this chapter, we will first look at the Indian boarding schools, one of the earlier government-funded efforts to do something about indigenous peoples by teaching them how to be more like the settlers. Then we will look at how the United States acquired what would become its 49th and 50th states. Acquiring Alaska and Hawaii without consent of indigenous peoples there demonstrated that the United States' interest in expansion did not stop at its coastlines. And as we will see later in this chapter, the U.S. government did not hesitate to pass aggressive laws going so far as to use the word termination to describe its goals for indigenous people and their nations. Education for extinction. For decades, government officials had pondered what sort of education Native children should have. In 1819, Congress passed the Indian Civilization Act, which provided thousands of dollars for missionaries to civilize and Christianize Native children at mission schools. Discussion about the role of Indian education in schools were part of treaty negotiations as Native nations ended their armed resistance and went to reservations. During President Grant's administration, Congress budgeted $100,000 for boarding schools to be located hundreds of miles away from reservations. And this move reflected the belief that the only way to educate indigenous children to be part of settler society was to isolate them from their cultures, families, and communities. The boarding schools were modeled on treatment of Native prisoners held at Fort Marion. In Chapter 8, as you read, that Fort Marion in Florida was used as a prisoner of war camp from 1875 to 1878. Captain Richard Henry Pratt was in charge of the captive Plains warriors there. On Pratt's orders, prisoner staff cut their hair, dressed them in army uniforms, had them drill like soldiers, and assigned them to manual labor such as picking fruits. Pratt considered this such a success that he followed the same model when he established the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879. Similar boarding schools also use the word industrial or training in their names to signify that the program emphasized skills students would need for various types of manual labor. The industrial school model began in 1800s in England, where boarding schools were created to train juvenile delinquents and children from families living in poverty. The photos below show indigenous students in classes at Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The boys are learning how to work with metal. The school assumed that native girls would know nothing about domestic arts and required them to attend classes where they could learn how to do things like iron clothes. Supported by Congress, Carlisle was a prototype for other federal boarding schools set up across the continent soon after. When Alaska became a U.S. territory, churches and the government set up similar schools there. Indigenous children were taken from their homes, sometimes with their parents' consent, sometimes by force. School officials cut their hair, changed their names to replace their traditional clothing with uniforms, and had them sleep in barracks-like dormitories. Boarding school education included typical subjects in addition to marching in formation and preparing for jobs as farmhands, carpenters, or domestic servants. Some parents chose to send their children to the schools. The government's violations of treaty agreement brought hardships that made it almost impossible for parents to properly care for their children. In some instances, parents believed their children would at least be fed at a boarding school. Others hoped that their children would learn English and be able to use the education they received to help fight ongoing treaty violations and exploitation by merchant settlers and government agents. In 1939, the philanthropist Edwin Embry published an account of a visit he had with a man he called Son Elk, who was thought to have been the first child from Taos Pueblo to attend Carlisle beginning in 1883. Embry quoted Son Elk's comment about his years at Carlisle. They told us that Indian ways were bad. They said we must get civilized. Remember that word too. It means be like the white man. I'm willing to be like the white man, but I do not believe Indians' ways were wrong. But they kept teaching us for 7 years, and the book told how bad the Indians had been to the white men, burning their towns and killing their women and children. But I had seen white men do that to Indians. We all wore white man's clothes and ate white man's food and went to white man's churches and spoke white man's talk. And so after a while, we also began to say Indians are bad. We laughed at our own people and their blankets and cooking pots and sacred societies and dances. Physical punishment was not typical in indigenous families, but was routine in boarding schools. The children were made to feel that it was criminal to be Indian. They could be beaten or physically punished for such things as speaking their own languages and practicing their cultural traditions. Many students who experienced such harsh treatments were psychologically damaged. Today, we might say that they had post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Even when they were done with boarding school, they carried the hurt with them into adulthood, and it often surfaced in their interactions with their families and communities. One woman talked about the long-term effects of her mother's boarding school experiences, and the stories she told were horrendous. They were beatings and having to kneel for hours on cold basement floors as punishments. My mother lived with the rage all her life, and I think the fact that they were taken away so young was part of this rage and how the fallout was on us as a family. When the effects of an experience like this are passed on to one's children in this way, it's called intergenerational trauma. Sexual abuse of both girls and boys in the missionary and boarding school was rampant. As sometimes happens today, adults in positions of authority sexually harassed, exploited, and abused young people in their care. The children were too far from home to turn to their parents' for protection. Even at those times when they could tell their parents what happened, the parents, many of whom had been sexually abused at the schools too, might not have known how to help them. Indigenous children at the school often run away to escape the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse they endured. In some instances, they died trying to get home. Indigenous parents and their children found ways to resist the boarding school's agenda and the harmful practices students encountered there. Running away from school was the most common way Indigenous children resisted. There were also acts of sabotage and refusal to participate. Many children continued to speak the languages and practice their ceremonies in secret. This resilience helps to explain why so many survived. Even so, the damage to so many children, families, and communities was lasting, and it is hard to fully understand. Beyond from sea to shining sea. At the same time, the United States was brutally colonizing, relocating, and killing indigenous peoples of the Americas. It was using similar methods to pursue overseas dominance. Between 1798 and 1990, the U.S. military intervened and in some cases occupied nations on every continent except Antarctica. Though these interventions, it added to its territories and eventually added what would become its 49th and 50th states in 1959. For thousands of years, the Kanaka Maoli native Hawaiians lived on the islands that are currently known as Hawaii. The people of different islands shared a common language and respect for the land as something to embrace rather than exploit. Hawaiians supported their communities by farming and fishing. By 1810, the islands were united under the Mo'i Kamehameha. Although the Hawaiian social and political structure was stratified, relationships among the classes were closer and relatively respectful compared to the oppressiveness of the European system of royalty, nobility, and commoners discussed in the beginning of this book. Just they had with indigenous peoples of the Americas, Europeans generally viewed Native Hawaiians as exotic, primitive heathens. Calvinist missionaries from the United States began arriving around 1820, and French priests of the Catholic churches arrived in the 1830s. Many Kanaka Maoli recognized that they were vulnerable to the colonization by Europe and the United States. They made a strategic decision to use the European tools such as writing and treaty making to secure their national sovereignty. The U.S. recognized Hawaiian independence in 1826. In 1840, the Kanaka Maoli created a constitution and made laws in much the same ways the British and the U.S. governments did. In 1843, Great Britain and France signed a joint proclamation recognizing Hawaii as an independent nation. Eventually, Hawaiians began electing their moi. A series of treaties enabled the United States to expand its whaling industry into Hawaiian waters and use Hawaiian agricultural land for sugar plantations. By the mid-1800s, Haole had gained significant influence. In 1887, a group of Haole men, with the support of the U.S. military, were able to force the Maui to approve a constitution that surrendered most of their political powers. The Hawaiian people used diplomatic and other nonviolent means to resist this U.S. interference with their sovereignty. But in 1893, with U.S. support and a group of powerful Haoles overthrew the Moi Liliuokalani, imprisoned her, and installed a Haole president. Despite diplomatic and other nonviolent resistance by many Kanaka Maoli, the U.S. annexed Hawaii in 1898. For thousands of years, the homelands of the indigenous people of what is currently known as the state of Alaska have included coastal regions, temperate rainforests, and Arctic tundra. Their population consists of hundreds of distinct groups speaking more than 20 different languages. The word Alaska is derived from an Unangan word that means place the sea moves towards. Colonizers' contact with indigenous peoples began around 1741, when a Russian mapping expedition led by Vidas Bering reached the area. A number of commercial expeditions followed, focused mainly on finding fur-bearing animals. Sea otter plates were especially sought after. They were as valuable at the time as oil is today. The first Russian settlement was established in 1784. The indigenous people fought to protect their communities and resources from the Russians, but were overwhelmed by Russia's weaponry. During the fur rush, Russians forced indigenous men to do the hunting by threatening to kill their families if they did not bring back enough furs. Russian colonization of Alaska lasted less than a century. In the time, the sea otter population was hunted to near extinction. Russia's desire to control Alaska faded as the fur trade declined and Russian empire expanded elsewhere. In 1867, Russia sold 600,000 square miles of Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, and the U.S. began its exploitation of Alaska's other resources. A series of gold rushes began in 1880. Mining destroyed streams, forests, and other ecosystems in the native Alaska homeland. Game animals and other wildlife central to the indigenous people's life lost much of their habitat, and the people suffered from a variety of diseases brought by the miners. Alaska also became the world's largest producer of canned salmon, but the canneries were owned by settlers and native rights to fish were restricted. White missionaries and settlers in Alaska spoke of native people as savage and inferior. Racial discrimination and segregation were legal. Indigenous peoples could be excluded from businesses and public places, and their children could not attend public schools with whites. In the early 1900s, a group of indigenous Alaskans formed the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood to resist segregation, forced assimilation, and efforts to take their lands. Their work led to several landmarks in social justice. They secured voting rights for Native Alaskans in 1922, and in 1945, they moved the Alaska territorial legislatures to pass the Alaska Civil Rights Act, successfully protests by the ANB and ANC predate those in the United States by several years, and it is recognized as the oldest Native American civil rights organization in the U.S.